Good evening and welcome to another episode of vBrownbag APAC. I'm your host and presenter tonight, Brett Johnson, and tonight we're going to go through a few things about group policy. We'll cover off some of the basics, how to create group policy items, talk about the inheritance, different sections within there, and also we'll go through some troubleshooting. I've got a extra lab set up to be able to go through some steps on why a policy isn't applying and ways to work through it. So before we get into it, we'll go through the usual quick notes. So anything vBrownbag is always available on Twitter at vBrownbag or LATAM EMEA and vBrownbag Junior. And with anything we do on Twitter, we also use the hashtag vBrownbag. And we've got a variety of shows throughout each week. So we've got the APAC one, EMEA, LATAM, and the US one. So if anything suits your time zone, you can always tune in live, or they will be made available on through YouTube and iTunes. And also for any more information on what we're doing, you can always visit us at professionalvmware.com or vbrownbag.com. So group policy. Group policy goes with Active Directory. You need to have Active Directory to be able to do anything with group policy, and you use group policy to be a central management for all your users and your computers. So you might have a set of users that you maybe don't want to have access to control panel, or you might want to remove their ability to use removable drives, for example, or you might have certain offices, so each site you might map specific printers to it based on that computer's site address using its subnet. So these are some of the sort of things you can do in group policy. Essentially, it is a graphical registry editor. Everything you do in there does actually have a registry key. Now, with group policy, you have your standard set of policies, templates, and preferences you can do that affect your Windows environments, specifically to do with the operating systems. You can also extend on those to use things called templates, which we'll cover off shortly. Now, with group policy is primarily managed through the management console, and that's available when you install Active Directory with the management tools. So you do need the graphical install, not core, if you want to do it directly on the server. The management console is also available as part of the remote server administration toolkit, which you can download from Microsoft. And there are a few PowerShell commandlets for group policy. You can do a bit in PowerShell, such as permissions and backing up and restoring policies. However, the majority of the work of actually putting the settings in policies is done through the management console. And the individual policies themselves end up getting stored in the sysfold directory, which allows them then to be replicated between your domain controllers. So there's various levels, and if you're familiar with Active Directory as its hierarchical concept, you know that there are sort of a hierarchy and it steps down, and generally more specific is sort of gets applied over anything else, and group policy is no different to that. So a computer can have its own group policy. So these are called local policies, so they'll affect that individual computer. And if you open up MMC and add a snap-in, you can actually see the policies there, or things such as secpol, so seccpol.msc will also allow you to set local policies. So they're the first one. So they get applied first, if they're set, that is. Then sites. So you can set per site. So if you break up sites, say in a geographical region, you might have, for example, policies telling computers that in those sites maybe which WSUS server to get their updates from. So they're not suddenly trying to get updates across a slow or an expensive link. They'll get one for a local server, and maybe that person's on a laptop, so when they change sites, so they just pick up, walk to another site, and it'll automatically detect they're in a new site, and then they can get a new policy and get updates from what is currently then the closest server. So that's sort of one area where you could use a site-based policy. Then domains, so if you have multiple domains, you can set a policy at the root of the domain, and that will push down to anything that's allowing, like, going to inherit that policy. And then the organizational units. So again, going back to Active Directory, you have your organizational units, and that's where a lot of your policies do actually get applied, is the OU level. And so each one of these overwrites. So a site will overwrite a local, domain overrides a site. So if there's conflicts, that sort of thing. So that's always the last one process that gets applied. Now, loopback is a bit of a special condition there. So this means if, say you've got a terminal server and you want all the users to have specific, like all their environment to be the same when they go onto that terminal server, you might do loopback. So that means the user settings applied to the computer's organizational unit will override the one applied to the user's organizational unit. So I'll go through that. I'll go through that shortly to sort of help visualize and explain it a bit better there. So this is when you have a group policy. In a group policy, you can have computer settings and user settings. Now, the way it usually works is if you've got a organizational unit that contains computers, and we'll just bring it up on this domain controller here. So this little test domain controller we've got here, this is just a bog standard DC. It's just got a couple of policies set up and a couple of OUs. So in a group policy, there's the computer configuration and user configuration. So if I was to have a organizational group policy linked here, and let's just create one. So, and I was in this user OU. So my account is in here, and the computer I log on to is in here. The effective policies when I log on without loopback processing would be, and we'll ignore all the other ones, but this computer configuration, any settings I set in here specific to this policy will be applied, and the user policies set here will be applied, and that's how they'll do it. So we'll have computer from the computer's policy and users from the user policy. Now, if I was to do loopback processing, what will happen is I'll log on to this computer. It'll run the computer policy from here and apply that. It will then apply my user policy and then come back and apply this user configuration. So we've got two options then when we do that. This can either just flat out overwrite the user configuration here, or we could do a merge. So a merge will merge those two settings with this one having precedence in conflict. So if there's one's got a setting that's enabled and another's got a setting that's disabled, the one that's whatever is set in here on that computer's policy will overwrite. So that's what loopback is, and that's how it sort of helps create a, like I said, for terminal servers, a more consistent environment for everybody that's on them. So when you create a policy, or when you use a group policy object or a GPO, there's two main sections within when you do an edit. There's a policy and there's a preference. So a policy, when you turn it off, for example, I have a policy enabled to disable control panel. When that's enabled, user can't use control panel at all. They'll get an access denied message. But when I remove that, they can, and the policy reapplies, they'll immediately be able to do it. So it's removed once it's what's called out of scope. If the setting, like if the application that the policy applies to is conflicting, so maybe Windows Firewall, you've allowed a port on locally on your computer, and you use group policy to block that port, that will override it. Or even more application specific, say you've Everyone has their own custom signatures in Outlook, and you've decided, nope, I don't want them to do that. I want them to have a company one, and you set that in a policy and group policy that will overwrite the application setting. And applications recognize it, and a lot of applications do have their own policy files available, so you can go beyond just the standard Windows system. So you could do things such as policies for Office, policies for, say, Google Chrome, and help keep your environment consistent and most importantly secure, and stop people doing things they usually shouldn't be doing. Now, a preference, it stays. So I could use a preference to do something like, I could put a shortcut on a user's desktop. I could map a drive. I could put a registry entry in, for example, using preferences. Now, when I take this out of scope, unlike a policy, it stays there. So applications can also overwrite policies. So while they do stay when it's removed, they're almost a suggestion. So I could turn it off. Like I could put that, going back to the icon on the desktop, if the user could possibly delete that icon, and that's fine. It's, like I said, it is a bit more of a preference. Well, obviously it is a bit more of a preference because it's called a preference. If you can't tell, it's late in the day and it's been a long day. So to show you these, and when we go to open or edit our group policy called test, and as you can see, I'm sticking with my very original name convention. We have a lot of policies. We have software installation stuff, so we could install a program. And this is just, like I said, this is bog standard. All this stuff, as you can see, is all pretty much Windows, or is all Windows based around the operating system. So we've got things like such as network shares, general components, where we can make changes. We can turn off the Windows calendar. You can set things such as regional settings. Now, under preferences, there's a lot less settings. Here's our regional one, so I'm a bit confusing. That's actually a preference. So I could set a regional preference here for, maybe I want the time to be the same, or one that I've found that can be quite important is date. I've seen a couple of applications where a computer's been installed, and being in Australia, most of we always do the day, month, year, and we've had a computer when the installation was done of the operating system, because it was a small site, there wasn't an image rolled out, we didn't use SCCM or anything like that, and it had the American date, which went month, day, year, and that actually caused a lot of problems in the software, because when they uploaded stuff to the database, the date was in an invalid format. So that's where something like setting these regional settings can become important. So it's not then just about making sure that the users can't do something, it then becomes about making sure your application is consistent, the data is consistent. Other things is internet settings. So there's a couple of settings depending on the browser version, and this hopefully will look familiar to everyone there, and you can set a lot of these settings. Now, some things such as trusted sites aren't actually set in here. They are set elsewhere. Doing this one off the top of my head. I've forgotten exactly where it is now. Internet settings. Oh, this is a pain. There is actually a setting in here. You might just have to take my word for it because I can't find it at the moment, called site to zone assignment list. Here we go. So, for example, we want certain things in trusted zones. Maybe, and this comes back to consistent environment. You've got a site, maybe it's doing a webinar, and to allow those security settings to be low enough to allow that streaming service to work, you might need to put it in here with a specific value. I believe it's A2 to allow that webinar to happen. So this is another thing where group policy can be quite handy, beyond just saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't access control panel, no, you can't use a USB drive, for example. Okay. So applying a GPO, GPOs get applied either to a site. Now, sites aren't visible through the group policy management console by default. That's takes about 3 seconds to add it in there. They can be applied to the root of the domain or any organizational unit. Now, one thing that a lot of people can find a bit confusing at the start is when you go into Active Directory, for example, you'll see, so we've got users, and this is where on a standard domain controller, that's where your first your users go by default until you start making customizations. Now, while it looks like it, this is not an OU. This is a container, so you can't actually apply a policy to a container. As you can see, if we collapse this down to reflect what we've got here, it's a lot different. So one of the things you've got to look for is anything without this tiny little symbol down there. If it doesn't have that, it's not an OU. So built in some of these other policies, whereas the ones that we can see is, so if we go down here now, we can actually see these. So these are OUs, which mean we can apply policies to them. Now, in terms of sites, as I said, they're not available by default. You can go right click on it, show sites, click on the sites. Again, this is just one domain controller. I'm only going to have one site, but you could add more sites. So if we want to create a group policy, we've got a couple of options. We can just right click and go new, hit OK, and there's our group policy. Now, as I haven't linked it to anything, I can do whatever I want in there and it's not going to affect anybody because it's not linked. That link needs to be established for the policy to actually have effect. Now, the other option is, and this one you only do if you really know it's actually going to work first time you do it, because it'll become effective immediately. There's no save button. What you click happens and it's done. You can create a GPO in this domain and link it here. And if I create one called, I hope this works, I've created a policy and I've linked it. Now, if I already have a policy that I want to work, I can just go link existing GPO. And then we can link an existing GPO. So it's fairly straightforward to apply links. Now, if you have one group policy that you don't want to delete the policy, or you don't want to delete the link, but you want to sort of take it out of rotation as such, you can also just disable that link. So it's there, and it's a bit hard to see, but when there's no link enabled, that little scroll is a slightly lighter color, and so it's a bit fainter, so it means it's not link enabled. And if we actually go here, we'll see the policies now that are in effect. So linked policies. And we'll go here, and if we look across, we'll see link enabled, no. Okay, so just having a look at the other sections. My PowerPoint's essentially just notes, so I don't go on too much of a tangent. When we apply a group policy, there's each group policy, and this is specific to the policy, not where you link it, is the security filtering. So maybe I have a policy that allows managers to have a specific share. I've got a couple of options for that. If I have a security group, and I'll just put one in just very quickly, managers. All right, so I've got a security group called managers. Now, say my organizational units are in a structure where all my managers and usual workers are in together, but I might have a policy that I don't want to apply to the general workforce that is more of a manager's one. Maybe it gives them a bit more freedom, or maybe just different drive mappings, something like that. We can either leave that as authenticated users, which then is going to apply to anybody. So anybody who authenticates against the domain is an authenticated user. Or we can remove this, and we could add this to managers. You can also do it to a individual user, but just like security policies, that's not exactly good practice. and you can have multiple ones there, just like anything else we do in terms of policies. Now, WMI filters. What we can use WMI filters for, and I don't actually have one set up on this domain to show you, but you can use a WMI filter to get some information. So when it goes to apply the policy, it's going to run a test. So you'll set up a filter, and this is really not a valid WMI filter, but I'll show you one in more detail with the troubleshooting one when we do. But a WMI filter, it runs a test against the computer when you log on. So you could do a WMI filter, so say you're doing a rollout of new software that requires all the computers to have 8 gig of RAM. You could do a WMI filter to say computer must have 8 gig of RAM. So you get that value from WMI, and Windows has some Microsoft has some good articles on Technic about it. So you'd put that out there, and it's going to return a value of true or false when it goes to apply the policy. And that policy will come back and it will go, okay, it's false, it's not going to apply. If it's true, the policy will then apply. So that applies to not individual settings, but the whole policy. And I realized I did mention one other thing about filtering who gets what in terms of applying a policy. So for example, if we go to our preferences and drive maps, to stick on the same example, if I map a drive, so I can, when I was saying you could have some managers get a drive and normal staff not, you've got a couple of options. You could have a drive here where you would create, and we'll call it doesn't validate the share, by the way, so it's good for testing this sort of thing. Okay, so if a normal user logged on, they might get, they'll get test, or anyone who the policy applies to will get that test drive. But then we might want to create one called and again, thankfully it doesn't validate because I just did make a few typos there. But anyway, what we can do under common is what's called item level targeting. And we can set very specific options. Now these are for preferences, not policies. So if you've got a policy where you're like, oh, I'm going to do a software installation, I'm going to use item level targeting. It's not going to work. You need to use like a WMI filter if you're going to go use that memory example. So we could do a security group here, which is listed here. I just can't use my alphabet at the moment to find it. There it is. And we could go find that group. Now we have this drive that's only going to apply to managers. It also gives us the security identifier, users in group, or say for a computer one, if the computer's in the group, apply that. So these are some of the things. And one other thing, processing filtered directory. So it helps tell us without having to open it if there's a filter applied. Now, these are some of the things that can make it a bit more complex. Instead of it goes beyond than just looking and saying, hey, yes, it's okay, it's applied to the OU. So these are the parts where you've got to start stepping through and start making use of the modeling and results, which we'll go through shortly. And nope, not this one. So linking options. So when we link down, by default, everything inherits. So my far down OUs will inherit everything from domain and each OU that's above it that has a policy applied. And that's how it works by default, and it's all good. Sometimes you don't want that to happen. Maybe you have a IT administrator's OU that you don't want to get certain restrictions come through, and for the way your directory structure is set up in AD, they've got to sit under some sort of organizational unit that has those restrictions on it. What you could do is turn on block inheritance. Now, to show you what this means is this more users OU has a few policies, and we can see at the top here that are inherited. We have nothing directly linked, but we have inherited policies. So if I was to block inheritance, suddenly, well, it does as the name says. It's just better than a lot of things you see on TV infomercials. It blocks inheritance. Now, what if though I want my default domain controller policy, which general rule of thumb, a lot of people just don't touch. Just leave it as it is. So let's go to domain GPO. We're going to enforce this. And what enforce means is that this policy is going to go through block inheritance. So you could cherry pick some of the ones here and apply them to that OU, or you can apply the enforce setting and they will push through. The other option is you can link all those ones to that specific OU. That's what enforced means, and that's what block inheritance means. Okay. Yes. Enforcing and blocking inheritance does add some complexity. And again, it goes past that point of just, yes, that's applied, that's in scope, it's all good. It starts to make you need to look a bit deeper. And I mean, when you get to certain areas, yes, you are going to inherit some sort of complexity. But where you can, it's always nice to keep it minimal, keep your job easy so you can have a few more coffee breaks. Now, if I wanted to have my IT admins, they could access, they might want to access users, but more users a bit tighter. We want to have a bit more control over policies that are applied to that. We can use what's called delegation to set certain permissions. So modeling and results, and I'll explain those a bit further later, but for our example is who can link a GPO. So maybe you want managers, because that's the sort of masochist I am, that I want my managers touching my GPO. And we can say if we want them to be able to link GPOs just for this container or this and child containers. And now they can do it. And the other area, one of the things you can use this for from a more realistic point of view is if you have a geographically segregated office, maybe speaking in Australia, you might have a office in or a region, say Latrobe Valley. You might have the Barossa Valley in South Australia, for example, and you might have dedicated IT teams to that. And they don't because of the distance, they're their own teams. They don't always communicate things, or they have different requirements. So we might not want team A, we might not want our Latrobe Valley team touching the Barossa Valley's organizational unit. So instead of just having straight out domain admins here, for example, or maybe the people that can do policy, we don't want them just to be domain admins. We could then have a Latrobe Valley IT support security group, which can only do that specific section of organizational units, and a Barossa Valley one who can only do theirs. So by doing that, we can then help segregate and control and limit the fallout if there is a mistake made, or sometimes, someone might get a bit too enthusiastic and think they've got a fantastic fix, but they don't have the oversight of what that region does, and can sometimes make a mess. Now, GPO replication and refresh. And I'm just making sure I can still read. So, by default, group policy will replicate every 15 minutes. And actually, no, sorry, I am mistaken on that. It refreshes up to every 90 minutes with a randomization of 30 minutes. So anywhere between, I think, 60 and 90 minutes. So disregard that top line. That's not as set in stone. That was a mistake, so I'm sorry about that one. Now, sites also, when you use your site settings for replication intervals, can vary it. And if you do need to manually push through an update, for sometimes you might have a security update that you need to get out there a bit quicker. There is a couple of options. You can right click on a specific GPO. So say I've applied I hope this works, to more users. I could update that one, So that's no computer ones, but you can do that. And you can also run this from with permissions, I can then update the policies by running gp update/force. Now, if I have a computer, maybe I've got a OU that I've applied to a computer and I'm testing it out and I'm not patient, and I'm kind of not. I could, on that computer before restarting it, I could push out I could run gp update/force on the computer and see how it goes. And some policies that you set do what's called a background refresh. So once it's updated, that applies. And with one of the ones I'll show you shortly is actually one of those settings. So we can do that, and that will apply and take effect immediately. Other policies will require, if they're a user level one, they will require the user to log off and then log back on to apply that policy. Or a computer level one, they will require the computer to restart. Now, in preparation for this, I did try to find a good little list to go through of ones that are background and ones that do require the restart, but it seemed to vary a bit and I couldn't get anything concrete. In my time playing with group policy, I've generally just assumed that if I'm changing a policy, they're going to need a log out and they're going to need to restart the computer if it's a computer level one. If it applies earlier, great. If it doesn't, well, I've already made the assumption of it's going to take longer than what it really did. So, and then you're not wrong, at least for the longer version. Now, that's right. So when, back to what I meant about the updating for computers, and that when a computer restarts, it doesn't just say, hey, these are my policies, I'm good to go. It'll check in with the domain controller, say, hey, what's new? Oh, all right, that's a bit different. Let's put that on. We're all good to go. And then when the user logs on, the same thing happens. It goes, hey, how's my policies? Yeah, that's a bit different. We'll do that one too. So they refresh each time you log on. It is part of the process, providing they can contact the domain controller and firewall ports are open where they need to be. Okay, so each setting within a group policy has three primary options. Now, these are for policies. Preferences are a bit different, a lot different. As you've probably seen, there's different things you can set there. There's the enabled option, so we've enabled that option. Disabled, funny enough, we've disabled the option. Not configured the default state for everything. That means that if I have a policy at a more preference level in terms of the inheritance, and I haven't set it, it's not configured, whatever above it. So this goes back to that, like if I have a local policy, it's been configured, and then because my group policies have the same setting, they're not configured. That's where the local one wins, because default state is not configured. They're available and they're almost scrapped. Now, there are some examples where they do word them in an interesting manner, where it's almost like a double negative. And unfortunately, I didn't find any examples from my looking through, but I have come across them, and you've got to read carefully in the description as to what does this actually mean, because sometimes disabling an option will actually give you the result you're looking for, in terms of, like, you could say allow this and you disable it. That's pretty straightforward, but then there's some that do say do not allow, and we can go from there. So just see if here we go. So do not show local area. So if we enable this, it's not going to show it. If we disable it, it will show it. So that's one of the examples right there, where you need to make sure you read it. Now, on the left-hand side, it gives you a description, and they always say when enabled the icon for, or when you disable. So they do tell you what the setting means for when you enable or disable it. And then sometimes when you enable as well, you have extra drop options. And however, say I enable this and I leave that as enabled state, it only tells me it's enabled here. It doesn't tell me the setting within the setting as such. So just because it's enabled, for some things you do it's always a good idea to actually open it up and have a look. And again, it will tell you then if you've got that extra setting, if you enable it, and then it'll give you the option of what the following states are as well. So you do get descriptions for it. If unsure, TechNet, I can never say that right, is always a really good resource, and there you go from there. Now, there are a lot of settings in group policy. This is all settings, and we've got a tiny little cursor over here, and we've got a lot of them. So if you have if your boss or you've got a ticket, whatever it happens to be, asking you to make a change for group policy, and you're not too sure where to look, one of your best places to look is Google. Just jumping in Google, you might say disable USB drives. I seem to be stuck on that example at the moment. So disable USB drives via GPO. And you will get articles and all that sort of stuff that comes up and will tell you how to do it. So there we go. So server fault's our first one for this. We've got social.technet and a lot of articles, and these will go into it and it will tell us the steps and where to go to be able to do this. So like I said, if you've got a specific task, you're gonna it's not too hard to Google. You just need to know that task, and you can go find that setting. And I'll spend a lot of time actually just Googling, finding the setting, and going from there to do a lot of things in within group policy. Now, one other thing, just while I think of it, some policies, there's what's called link detection. So some policies, the one I can think of off the top of my head is redirected folders, or things such as offline files. They can have a policy based on how fast the link is. So you can set parameters to determine if a link is slow and what happens with a slow link. And if I can find it, folder redirection, I think it's in here. No, it's not in there. Sorry, I can't remember it off the top of my head. This is just an impromptu thought. But you can have certain things about your network, and redirected folders is one of them, and offline files, branch cache. They're different things where they can say, okay, your link is slow. We're going to maybe not apply the policy, or we're going to use something else. So link detection is one of those things, and it does come up when we do our results, not modeling, and it will say, hey, the link speeds this, so then you can interpret why that policy did or did not apply. Sometimes the policy applying is actually a bad thing. Finally, we get on to results and modeling. So these are two really good tools for working out why my GPO is behaving this way, or sometimes how I expect it to behave when I put it in live. Now, in terms of that, and before we get onto these, one of the things I always make sure is when I'm working with group policies, I always have a virtual machine with that operating system that we're doing it on. If it's going to be like an operating system one, if it's Word or Excel or something like that, you make sure you got the right version. And before you put anything into group policy that's live, you want to have maybe a test OU where you can put it in there with a test user, even just like on a VM that's on the domain. It really just needs to be able to say, this policy is applied, it's met these credentials, or these criteria, I should say, and it's working. Otherwise, you may end up with something like, okay, I've put it out there and I have an unexpected result, and that can affect a lot of people. And it's the general thing for using tests first is just to make sure it works, and making sure you don't miss things. As your group policy settings grow, it can become more complex. Maybe it has a conflicting setting with something else. So you want to be able to nut all this out before you put it into production and disrupt people and just have an all-round bad day. So, group policy modeling. So this models what's expected. This does not model what does happen. This is what I expect to happen. Now I can select various domain controllers or just pick the first one. If I had other domains, I can do that. I've only got the one. Now, when we select the computer, we're going to select, or we can either select, which OU, and you can use containers for this as well. So if it's in the default one, or for the first one we do is users. Late at night reading, it never goes well, does it? So for users, let's put in me, and again, we can do a computer by name, or here we go, demo workstation. Now, I like to use user and computer specifically when there's a specific user having a problem. Or container if is more, okay, well I'm going to deploy to these users out and they're using these computers. So it depends on your need for which one you do. Specific problem, specify specifically. You're just trying to ascertain and get a good gauge of how it's going to go. Then containers is all good. Now we can just skip straight to the end as this self-explanatory bit of text works. We can simulate loopback processing. We can put it in a certain site. Slow network connection. So for example, I want to simulate, maybe I do have a site which has a bit of a dodgy WAN link that gets a bit bogged down in the morning. So we can simulate this to see what happens. So that's our user location. So these are network locations and all that. It just pulls that from the start. Security groups. Again, and then the computer one. So you have your user security groups and your computer security groups because they can go in as well. And you can also use that for your applying policy. So that manager example I gave you can also apply to specific computers, maybe kiosk computers. You want to have them really locked down. You can add additional WMIs that aren't part of it. So like I said, this is modeling. This is what I expect to happen when I do this. Hopefully 1 + 1 = 2. Sometimes it equals 53. So again, we specify WMI for filters, WMI for computers, then we get the summary. Now, if we went all the way back to our first page, we tick this, we hit next, we're done. Okay, so we've got a couple of messages come up, AD. Now, like I said, this is a bog standard domain control. It's probably about an hour and a half old, so I'm not really concerned about my errors. If you had these, you probably do want to look into them. And what this is going to go through is it's going to say, hey, look, these policies here are what's applied. It'll tell you the applied GPOs and denied GPOs. I don't actually, oh, look at that, I have a denied one. There we go. I've got a bit lucky on this example. So I have one because the link is disabled. So if we go up, so we've got the one called demo, link's not enabled. So that's why that policy was denied, which is all good. Now, when I've been playing previously with WMI filters, one of the ones I did, the last one I did, I think it was only a couple of weeks back, was just to determine the operating system version because I didn't want a script for an application to run on anything that was a server, so whether it was a domain controller or a member server. They're two different values. It was designed to run on workstations. When doing the modeling, the WMI filter always came back true because it doesn't seem to actually apply. It always came back true. When I ran the results, it came back false, which was giving me the result that I was actually seeing on the computer. So there is a bit of a difference. And that was despite me, for some reason, putting it in. Like I put it in when I ran the query to put the WMI filter in, but for some reason, it always came back true. I'm not going to say you're going to have that experience, but it's one of those things just to keep an eye out for. Now, say you've made a change, you don't need to go back through the whole wizard. We can just rerun query and we're good. Now, results is a bit different. So we can run it against this computer or we can run it against another one. So we'll run it against our demo workstation. Now this will contact that computer, server, whatever it happens to be, and it will say, okay, who's logged on last? Or who's logged on? Who do I have records for? Okay, and off we go. Now I think this is going to come back with a WMI error because it's taking much longer. There we go. So RPC server not available. Now this has come about because when I was setting all this up, it didn't get the DNS details correctly because, well, I put in the wrong DNS server, so that's, a lot my fault. Which means, and when that happens, you'll generally find that you need to allow an app through the firewall. And we'll see here remote management interface or instrumentation is not on. So let's turn that on. And I think that should be the only one we need to do. Okay. Now let's give this another crack. Hopefully I did it right. Maybe I didn't. Which one am I missing? Net logon service. I think that's the other one I need to do. There we go. See, we enabled net logon service. So we've got the 2 users here. I've got 2 user accounts, so we've got 2 users, so you could have more. So Brett at Downfall is complaining that his policy is restricted to something that we said we'd let him do. He was a silly fool for believing us. But what we can see when we do this is we've got our mismatch errors, but it's much the same as the modeling. The difference is, though, this is pulling what did happen. So if I made a change in group policy and I ran a results, that change wouldn't be reflected in results, it'd be reflected in modeling. So we can then see a lot of the same sort of stuff that the WMI filter is. Which one was this? This is the local group policy, so it got denied. Whereas, did we even see local group policy here? No. Look at that. The local group policy down here is not shown. So that's one of the differences. That was coming back as also coming back with demo being denied because of the link disabled. And we can see here that it's not there. So when I logged on, there was different policies to what we see in modeling. So that's one of the big differences. Now, on a workstation or directly from the workstation, you can run the resultant. Sorry, I can never say that word properly. I do apologize. Set of policies, or better than that, just RSOP. Now, if you run this without local administrative rights, you're going to get hit with a access denied. Now, that doesn't mean all is lost. I can still see user configurations. So what this can do is, if I have an error when I log on, so say it's like, oh yeah, we're processing, but there was some sort of error doing it. We can see this in RSOP. Now, if I was to run as administrator, oops. Oh, bloody hell. This is just downright embarrassing. There we go. Alright, so now we're running as administrator. We don't have our access denied message. And what we're going to see, okay, resultant. What we're going to see is the computer policies as well, not just the user ones. Because, if a user says what users apply to, but sometimes we don't want them to see the theoretical settings that we have applied. So we've got the password settings, audit policies, all that sort of jazz. And you get like little warning triangles if something's not quite right. Now, the other place to check if you're having a issue with a policy applying. So an example I've come across before was we moved folder redirection from one server to another, and the permissions we had a couple of permissions issue. No, sorry, it wasn't the move. There was a restore from backup. So the client got hit by a crypto virus. We had to restore from backup, and the security policies or the NTFS security permissions didn't apply back to the folders. So what we could see in here in Event Viewer was we could see the folder redirection where it applied. We're not going to see that because I don't have it set up here, and it came back with an error, and we could use that error then to troubleshoot the message. So I've got a few different areas there where we can look at and say, all right, what's going on? What can we do about it? Why is this broken? So administrative templates. These expand what group policy can do. If you've had a look at the policies we've had there, everything's pretty much been based, or has been based around the operating system. Now, there's two types of administrative templates: ADM files, which I really hope you never have to deal with, because let's face it, then you're going to be using Server 2003 as your servers, or XP or earlier, and you probably want to be finding some money to replace those instead. Now, ADMX files, they're our new ones. They're XML based, and they sit in what's called a central store, which by default is in Windows and policy definitions, as we see right here. Now, Now, there's the ADMX file with ADMX ones, and these are ones we'll concentrate on because ADM, it's old, and to be honest, I think I've done twice. So with an ADMX file, you have the ADMX file, which contains all the settings. So it can be read by group policy, the settings go in, and you can enable, disable, not configure. And then you have your ADML, which is the language file. So if you have a multiple language system, then you're going to need the multiple language files, and then that gets replicated throughout your as part of sysvol. So when we go into Windows and policy definitions, these are ADMX files. Now, as you can see, there's various ones there: disk quota, so on and so forth. Now, as I said, they're XML based, and that's what they look like. We've got a hotspot. I'm not going to pretend to know what's in there. I'm just going to let you know that you can look into it. And I've only got English US, and they are the language files. So installing administrative templates really can't be much easier. So this is, I think this is the Office templates. I went to, believe it or not, Google, and I grabbed the Office templates. I downloaded it from the link, or from the Microsoft download link, and these are the ADMX files. Yeah, all we do is we grab them, we paste them, grab the relevant language setting ones. Again, I'm only using English US. If you've got multiple languages, you'll need to put those in there, and close that off. Open group policy again, and we can, it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be a new policy, it can be a new one, it can be an existing policy. So we'll do the I hope this works, because when recording you always hope it works. And now we have Microsoft Office settings, and that's all it takes. Now that will replicate around my imaginary domain to my imaginary domain controllers, and off she goes. So it's quite simple, and you can go from there. Now we could do Chrome files, like if we wanted to be able to manage Google Chrome and say, hey, users have to go through our proxy server, we could put in Chrome. we could do it. I believe Firefox has it. There's a lot of different ones out there you can use to help control the applications. Essentially, as I said, it's a registry setting. So one example with Office 2016 is there is a update setting in here somewhere. I'm going to say somewhere because I can't remember it off the top of my head. There's just too many. And if I was to set that, it applies to a HKey local machine registry setting, which tells it where to get the updates from. So you could make use of that for updating Office from a central location when you're using, say, Click to Run. Or there's registry settings for WSUS to say where they want to get the updates from, if not from Microsoft.com, so that you want to get them from an intranet server. Again, that's a registry setting, and that's what your group policy does. It's a graphical glorified registry editor, but it does work very well. Now, PowerShell. So there's not a great deal you do with PowerShell for group policy. I've primarily just used it personally just to have the backup restore sections. You can also use it to import. It's quite straightforward. You just got to import the module. I'm pretty sure I've got it here. So we can back up group policies by name, or I think it's the all option, and then we can set a path. So and there we go. Now, with group policies, you'll see these GPO IDs. Now, if we go into, and you'll also notice that they don't, sorry, I'll get to that in a second. This is the ID, the unique ID, and that will line up with, so let's actually pick the right one. I think that's the one. Yep, there it is, GPO ID. That's its file name. So I'm going to do something dumb, and I'm going to break a group policy. Just, I don't know, because we can. So just to show you where they sit and how it works. So we go into policies and we'll see. So we're looking for 6B. So this here is our OU GPO. And you can see we've got machine and computer. Now, if I started actually setting policies in here and preferences, so let's just set one, and what we end up with now is we have a registry.pol. So this is where it goes. So if these folders have something in them, that's where the settings go. Now, if I was to go yoink and move that, it now can't find it. So this is something like you really don't do live, but it's just to give you an idea that to give the demonstration that these policies are just files. We can put it back, and now our permissions are wrong. So we hit OK, and it will fix the permissions up for us, and everything is back to how it is. Now this is essentially what a group policy backup does, except it doesn't bugger up the permissions like a cut and paste. So from I think if I was to delete that, and it's like, uh-oh, and it's completely different, disappeared because I didn't intend to do it. Maybe whatever happened, it's no longer there. So what we can do is we can delete this from our group policy, and we can restore. Browse. and there are our backups that we took before. So when you do multiple backups, you do get to see multiple times of where, like when it was done. So if you've done them, or you can tick this and just have the latest one. So we hit restore. Yes. OU GPO is restored. Fantastic. And because I did the backup before I made the change, we can see it's all empty. Now, here's the thing. When you restore, it does not restore the links. So make sure your links are documented. So when you restore, they're actually all in the right place. And there's a PowerShell list. There's a TechNet link for the PowerShell commandlets for those playing at home. You can also set the permissions, and you can do the links as well. So when things go wrong, good chance it's a typo, or you've just overlooked something. They're your two biggest reasons something goes wrong. And other than that, we start then to look into what else could it be. Could it be the loopback is producing unexpected results? Is it something like the inheritance order? Have I miscalculated that? Is my logical layout not suitable, or am I OUs in an impractical way to do it? Or am I trying to apply a user policy to a computer OU, so one that contains all my computers? So these are some of the things that you sort of start to work through. And I've actually broken one of my labs that hopefully I've broken in a manner that I can actually unbreak. So, come on, pause. What are you doing? Oh, well, it's on a different network anyway. So, I have another DC and a workstation. So, now, my intention with these is just to go through some of it, is to map a drive. It's a very, very simple one. It's a preference. It'll show up. We're going to map an F drive to something that doesn't exist. It's quite simple. Now, my user's OU contains a user called Brett. There I am. Groovy. We don't need to really worry about the computers one, because this is just to see how it applies, and also give a demonstration of WMI filters as well. So Brett's sitting there, he's all good. Brett's a cool kind of guy, if I say so myself. Now, the policy also has a WMI filter on it. And we can see this under I forgot, I saw it down here. It's got one, so it applies to member services. So the idea is that if I was to do this on a real policy, I'd be looking at saying, okay, so I only want this to apply to servers. I don't want it to apply to desktops, and I don't want it to apply to domain controllers. Okay, that's good. We can do that. We can filter down further. We can use security groups. We can use a few different things, but as a broad stroke, that's what we want to do. When a server has a product, what we can see here, so we've got all this here, so I've lost train of thought there. So when I log on to Workstation, there I am, I should, because it's applied, get a drive, but it's not working. Okay, so I've logged on. Let's check the results. So I think I did actually just call it Workstation. There we go, Workstation. And it's not going to work. Now, the reason is exactly the same as the other one. Oh, that's interesting. That's on a public network. I wonder what that could be. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, now, without checking, this is incorrect. This old domain controller IP address doesn't work. Now, my only domain controller is .2. Now, even though I had .2 specified, because it was in the second one, the top one wasn't contactable, it's not detecting this as a domain network. That's one of the problems. Okay, so if that's wrong, maybe it's out of date here too. Domain controller, same sort of thing. So a domain controller's DNS server, top one, should always point to itself. The fact that the gateway is not set at the above is a non-issue. So, well, you can either use 127.0.0.1 or you can use the actual IP address. So now we want it to look at itself, and it's still a public network. So we could reboot it, or we can just restart network location awareness. Now the reason why this is important to go through it is, and get this right, is that the firewall rules that we want to allow certain things for our domain are going to make a big difference here. So for that, we need to set that up, and now we're on a domain network, which is excellent. Now this one's done, and we have the same thing. So we could restart it, or we can just, again, do the exact same things, restart network location awareness. And this goes to the, oh, that's right, I'm not an administrator. So this also goes to show the importance of, sorry. So this goes to show the importance of having proper DNS when dealing with Active Directory. If it's not correct, you're going to have all sorts of problems. So there's our first issue, is that our DNS was incorrect. Now, so we'll do the restart. Alright, so we've checked our networking. That's one of the first things we'll check. Usually we won't just jump straight in and make sure the firewall's there. We'll check our networking, and we found this issue. Again, we're starting with the basics. So now that we're on that, are we all good? And I can tell you the answer is going to be no. It's still not going to work. So then we remember that because we started up on a public network, certain firewall options are not enabled to come through. And for these ones we need WMI and net logon service. And once we set those, look at that. So now we'll go through and we'll see if there was any result come through on this. There was an error. And we're only looking at setting here, and oh, denied. Why was that denied? Okay, so false WMI filter. So this is where we can find that our WMI filter was denied because it came back false. So I had domain servers set as 3, which is actually sorry, I had a typo in it. There we go, we're using our typo example. It's not an operation system. It's an operating system. It's funny how that works, isn't it? And so we've set that. So we've got now the operating system type is 3. Now we can, I've got to remember this one. This might be not the best one to do on the fly, but WMI object, we can use PowerShell to get the, we can use it to verify we can use it to verify what our settings are going to come back as for our WMI filters that we're going to do. So if we've got, a certain thing that we want to go into, we can do that. So for this, it should be, I believe it's product type. Okay, and it is 3. So if you can see that there. Damn, there's no font option. Okay, so it's 3. So at least we've found that we've had one typo here, so we just need to make sure we don't have another typo here. So that's good. So if I ran the results again, I would get the same result. So we've realized that we've had some incorrect networking, which has caused us to have to look at the firewall as well. And then we've realized we've fat-fingered the WMI filter. So now we've done that. I believe this is a background refresh policy or preference. So we're just going to run a GP update-force. Now, if you have a lot of domain controllers, it's not always the best idea to run GP update-force because it's going to push it out to everything, and it may generate a lot of traffic that you do not want. Let's see if this is a background one. There it goes. So it's a very, very simple example of how little things can stop a policy working, and this is part of the reason why it's good to utilize the tools. So the ability to have test VMs. I mean, you could do this in Workstation like I'm doing. If you want to test something, you could actually run it up as a host. You can, you've got your tools to say that, like your results, you've got your modeling. So it's just a quick example of check the basics, start with your networking, start with your DNS. Make sure that's good. If your DNS is out and you're getting that RPC error, so if your DNS is fine, you get that RPC error when running results, check your firewall, go from there. Again, this is just a basic example, but it's just a lot of the time GPO works really well. It's not perfect, nothing is, but it's quite a reliable technology. It's quite a reliable way to manage your computers. So check it out, and yeah, just have a play. It doesn't take much. If you did want to do it yourself at home, VMware Workstation or say a VirtualBox, which is free, and run up 2 computers, just have 2 sit there, play with your settings, see what works, see what effects they have, and then start playing with WMI filters. So maybe set one where it only works if there's more than 4 gig of RAM, and change the RAM up and down, and just, it doesn't, when you play with these things, especially say your WMI filters, to learn, the filter you put doesn't have to apply to the task you're doing. All you're really trying to do is learn what happens when I do it. So then when you have to do it live and you got a bit of pressure, or you're trying to fix something that someone's done as a group policy, you at least have a solid understanding of how the pieces go together, and you can just go through, or at the very least, you're going to be able to find some basic information to then ask the right questions when you need to ask for help. And if you really get stuck, always ask for help. So that's the end of tonight's presentation. I hope you found it useful, and I've been Brett Johnson. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at BrettJohnson008, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you very much.